There is a moment, somewhere between the Earth and the Moon, where three men looked at each other in the cold silence of space and understood with absolute bone-deep clarity that they might never come home. No rescue was coming, no one could reach them. The void stretched in every direction for hundreds of thousands of miles, and the machine that was supposed to carry them safely through it had just torn itself apart from the inside. Oxygen was bleeding into space. Power was dying. The mission, the grand, glorious mission that had taken years to plan, billions of dollars to build, and the combined brilliance of hundreds of thousands of human minds to execute, was over. And yet, they came home. This is the story of Apollo 13, not just a mission, not just a disaster, but perhaps the single greatest act of collective human problem-solving ever attempted under impossible conditions. A story where the most dangerous place in the known universe became a test of something far more fragile and far more powerful than rocket engines and oxygen tanks. It became a test of the human will to survive. And on April 13, 1970, that will was put to a test unlike anything the world had ever seen before. To understand what happened on Apollo 13, you have to understand what it meant to go to the moon in 1970. Today we live in an age where space travel, while still extraordinary, has become almost routine in the public imagination. We have a space station orbiting the Earth right now. Private companies launch rockets on a weekly basis. Astronauts are celebrated, but they are not the demigods they once were. In 1970, a man walking on the moon was still the single most awe-inspiring achievement in the entire history of the human race. It had only happened once before. Neil Armstrong had stepped onto the lunar surface less than a year earlier, on July 20, 1969. And the world had stopped breathing for those few seconds as his boot touched the gray dust of another world. It was the culmination of a decade-long race against the Soviet Union. It was the fulfillment of a promise made by a young, doomed president who had stood before Congress in 1961 and declared that America would go to the moon before the end of the decade. It was the impossible made real. And so by April 1970, Apollo 13 was supposed to be something almost mundane by comparison. The third lunar landing, another step forward, another chapter in what everyone assumed would be a long and triumphant story of human exploration beyond the atmosphere. The crew, Commander James Arthur Lovell Jr., Command Module Pilot John Leonard Swigert Jr., and Lunar Module Pilot Fred Wallace Hayes Jr., were experienced, professional, calm. Lovell was a legend in his own right, a veteran of 3 previous spaceflights including Apollo 8, the first mission to orbit the moon. He was supposed to be one of the first men to walk on the moon's surface during this mission, to feel that gray dust beneath his boots, to look up at the blue marble hanging in the black and know he had reached the furthest point any human being had ever traveled. The mission launched on April 11, 1970 from Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral. It was a Saturday, the weather was clear. The Saturn V rocket, still the most powerful machine ever built by human hands, roared to life and tore itself away from the Earth with controlled violence, pushing 3 men and their spacecraft out of the cradle of gravity and into the dark. The launch went well. The first 2 days of the mission went well. There were minor issues, there always were, but nothing that alarmed the flight controllers at Mission Control in Houston. Everything was nominal, everything was on track. Commander Lovell and his crew were nearly 200,000 miles from Earth, cruising toward the moon at roughly 2,000 miles per hour, comfortable and confident, when the universe decided to remind them of something important. Space does not care about your plans. At 9:08 p.m. Central Standard Time on April 13, 1970, 55 hours, 54 minutes, and 53 seconds into the mission, oxygen tank number 2 in the service module exploded. The sound hit the crew like a thunderclap. There was a bang, a loud, definitive, terrible bang, and then the spacecraft shuddered, and warning lights began to blink on across the instrument panel like malevolent stars waking up one by one. Jack Swigert, cool and professional even in that first terrible second, radioed Mission Control with what has become one of the most famous understatements in human history. "Houston," he said, "we've had a problem here." Flight Director Gene Kranz, sitting in Mission Control and staring at a panel of instruments that had just gone haywire, asked for clarification. It was Lovell who responded this time, his voice still measured, still controlled, the voice of a man who had trained his entire life to stay calm in moments like this one. "Houston, we've had a problem." They had, to put it mildly, had a problem. The explosion had been catastrophic. Oxygen tank 2 had not merely malfunctioned, it had ruptured, and the force of that rupture had damaged oxygen tank 1 as well. Oxygen, which the crew needed to breathe and which the fuel cells needed to generate electricity, was venting into space. Through a small window, Jim Lovell watched it go, a thin, ghostly plume of gas escaping into the void, and in that moment, with the cold clarity of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at, he understood that the mission was over. They were not going to the moon. The question now was whether they were going to survive at all. "We are venting something out into space," he reported to Houston, and those words, spoken quietly in the dark of a dying spacecraft hundreds of thousands of miles from Earth, marked the moment that Apollo 13 stopped being a mission of exploration and became a mission of survival. What had caused the explosion? The full answer would only emerge after exhaustive investigation in the days, weeks, and months that followed. But the seeds of the disaster had been planted long before launch, not in space, but on the ground in the mundane, unglamorous world of testing and quality control, and the kind of small, compounding errors that, individually, seem insignificant and together can kill you. The oxygen tanks in the Apollo spacecraft used heaters to keep the liquid oxygen from becoming too cold and sloshy to flow properly. These heaters were supposed to operate at 28 volts of power, which was the standard supply available during ground testing. But at some point during the engineering and manufacturing process, a decision was made to upgrade a component in the command module, a decision that changed the voltage to 65 volts. Nobody updated the specification for the oxygen tank heaters to match this change. Nobody caught the discrepancy. During a pre-launch test in March 1970, technicians tried to drain oxygen tank 2 and found that it wouldn't drain properly. They decided to boil off the remaining oxygen by running the heaters, but because the heaters were rated for 28 volts and were now receiving 65 volts, they ran too hot. The thermostat that was supposed to prevent overheating, it was designed for 28 volts too. It welded itself shut under the excess current and stopped working. The heaters burned unchecked for 8 hours, reaching temperatures of perhaps 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, far beyond anything the Teflon insulation on the internal wiring was designed to withstand. The insulation was damaged. The wires inside Tank 2 were now bare, exposed, waiting. For weeks that damaged tank sat inside the service module, looking perfectly normal from the outside, carrying its invisible flaw into space. And then on the evening of April 13, when Mission Control asked the crew to perform a routine procedure, stirring the oxygen tanks to prevent the liquid oxygen from stratifying, Swigert flipped the switch. Current ran through those bare, damaged wires. There was a short circuit, there was a spark, and then there was an explosion. In Houston, the flight controllers stared at their screens in disbelief. The data coming back from the spacecraft was contradictory, chaotic, impossible to make immediate sense of. Some of them thought initially that it was an instrumentation problem, that the sensors had malfunctioned rather than the spacecraft itself. Gene Kranz, who had been flight director for nearly every critical mission since the early days of Gemini, stood at the front of the room and forced himself to think clearly. He was 46 years old, a former military pilot, a man who had built his entire philosophy of spaceflight around the idea that there was always a solution, always a path forward, as long as you kept your head and kept working the problem. He would need every ounce of that philosophy in the hours to come. The first priority was power. With both oxygen tanks compromised, the fuel cells that generated electricity for the command module, the spacecraft capsule in which the crew lived and in which they would need to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere, were dying. They had perhaps 15 minutes of power left in the command module, maybe less. If that power died completely, the command module was dead, and without the command module there was no re-entry, no parachutes, no splashdown, no survival. But attached to the command module there was another spacecraft. The lunar module, the spindly, insect-like lander that was supposed to carry Lovell and Hayes down to the moon's surface, was still intact, still powered, still alive. It had its own oxygen supply, its own batteries, its own life support systems. It had been designed to keep 2 men alive for 2 days on the surface of the moon. Now it was going to have to keep 3 men alive for 4 days in space. The decision was made almost immediately: power down the command module, preserve what was left of its batteries for re-entry, and move the crew into the lunar module, which would serve as a lifeboat. It was not a simple decision. Moving 3 men into a spacecraft designed for 2 in the middle of a crisis, while simultaneously trying to figure out whether the service module's explosion had damaged the heat shield that would protect them from burning up during re-entry, while managing power and oxygen and water and trajectory, all of it happening at once, all of it happening in real time. All of it happening with 3 men's lives in the balance and the entire world watching. This was not simple at all. But there was no other option, and so they did it. Jim Lovell guided his crew into the lunar module. The command module systems were powered down to a minimum, its batteries stored like bank coals, their precious charge saved for the moment they would be desperately needed. The lunar module, which the crew called Aquarius, named for the water-bearer of mythology which seemed suddenly and painfully appropriate, hummed to life around them. It was cramped, it was cold, it was never designed for this, but it was alive, and as long as it was alive, so were they. And now in mission control, the real work began. Gene Kranz pulled his white team of flight controllers off the main console and sent them to a back room, a quarantine of focus, away from the constant stream of data and decisions flowing through the main control room. He had one instruction for them: figure out how to get the crew home, not how to save the mission, not how to get to the moon, how to get those 3 men home. Everything else was secondary, everything else was noise. His instruction to his team, the words that would later be immortalized in film and in history, was simple and absolute: failure is not an option. Let that phrase sit with you for a moment. Failure is not an option. It sounds like a motivational poster. It sounds like something you'd see printed on a corporate coffee mug. But in that room, in that moment, spoken by that man to those people about those 3 lives hanging in the dark between the earth and the moon, it was not a slogan. It was a statement of intent. It was a declaration of war against the impossible. Gene Kranz and his team were not going to accept that Jim Lovell and Jack Swigert and Fred Hayes were going to die. They were going to solve this problem. They were going to find a way. And then they were going to execute that way with absolute precision, because there was no margin for error and no second chances and no going back. The problems they faced were staggering in their complexity. The first was navigation. The spacecraft was on a trajectory toward the moon, not toward the Earth. To get home, they would need to perform a burn with the lunar module's descent engine, using its rocket to alter their course and set them on a path back to Earth. But the lunar module's navigation systems were not designed for this kind of freefall trajectory calculation. The guidance computer in the lunar module was a marvel of 1960s technology, about as powerful as a pocket calculator by modern standards. And asking it to perform calculations it had never been designed for, in a situation no one had ever planned for, was like asking a bicycle to function as a Formula One racing car. Engineers and mathematicians in Houston worked through the night, performing calculations by hand that the computers couldn't handle, feeding new instructions up to the crew. Jim Lovell, using nothing but the Earth as a navigation reference point, eyeballing it through the spacecraft's window, using his own vision and judgment as a kind of celestial sextant, helped guide the burn that would send them home. The burn was performed, it worked, they were going home. But the problems kept coming, like waves against a breakwater. The carbon dioxide problem was perhaps the most insidious, the kind of danger that is invisible until it kills you. Human beings breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide. In the confined, sealed environment of a spacecraft, carbon dioxide builds up in the atmosphere, and if it builds up too much, it becomes toxic. The lunar module had canisters of lithium hydroxide designed to scrub the carbon dioxide from the air. But those canisters, designed for 2 men for 2 days, were not going to be enough for 3 men for 4 days. And the command module's lithium hydroxide canisters, which were plentiful and fully stocked, were the wrong shape. They were square. The lunar module's CO2 scrubber used round canisters. In the deadly arithmetic of survival, the square canisters were useless. Back in Houston, engineers from the life support team gathered around a table covered in every item that the crew had access to on the spacecraft, every bit of equipment, every piece of material, every tool and bag and piece of hose and scrap of tape. Their mission: figure out how to make a square peg fit in a round hole using only what the crew had on board. What they came up with: a jury-rigged contraption assembled from a plastic bag, a cardboard cuff from a flight manual cover, a sock and yards of duct tape. Sounds like something a child might build in an afternoon. But it worked. Engineers on the ground talked Lovell and his crew through the construction step by step, and the improvised adapter was installed and the carbon dioxide levels dropped, and 3 men kept breathing when they should have choked. The temperature inside Aquarius dropped to near freezing. They were conserving every watt of power, and heat was a luxury they couldn't afford. The crew huddled together in the cold, unable to sleep properly, drinking barely enough water to stay hydrated because they needed to conserve that too. Fred Hayes developed a urinary tract infection from the cold and the stress. They were exhausted, physically deteriorating, operating at the edge of their limits, and yet they kept going. They kept talking to Houston. They kept following the checklist of procedures that the teams on the ground were developing in real time, procedure after procedure that had never been written down before because nobody had ever imagined that anyone would need them. Every few hours there was a new crisis, a new problem to solve, a new calculation to run, or a new procedure to improvise. And every time, the combined effort of the crew and the ground teams found a way through. Meanwhile, the world watched. The Apollo 13 mission had launched with relatively little fanfare. The public, which had been electrified by Apollo 11 and reasonably impressed by Apollo 12, was already beginning to find routine moon missions slightly routine. One television network had declined to carry a live broadcast from the crew mid-mission because the ratings weren't there. But when news of the explosion broke, everything changed. Television cameras that had been pointed elsewhere swung back to space. Newspapers ran the story on their front pages. People who had been going about their normal lives suddenly found themselves glued to their radios and televisions, tracking the progress of three men trying to find their way home from the most hostile environment imaginable. Churches held prayer services. Governments around the world, including the Soviet Union, which had been America's competitor in the space race and was operating its own lunar program, offered assistance and extended their sympathies. The rivalry of nations dissolved briefly in the face of shared human vulnerability. Because that is what Apollo 13 revealed about us, about all of us, about the species that had climbed down from the trees and looked up at the stars and decided improbably that they needed to go there. It revealed that at the moment of maximum danger, maximum stress, maximum despair, when all the grand ambitions had been stripped away and the only thing left was the raw, essential question of survival, human beings are capable of something extraordinary. They are capable of rising. Not just the astronauts, not just the flight controllers, the entire enormous apparatus of engineers and mathematicians and technicians and administrators and support staff who worked around the clock for 4 days to solve an unsolvable problem. The flight controllers who hadn't slept in 36 hours but who sat at their consoles and kept working because those were their guys up there and they were not going to let them die. The NASA managers who set aside every consideration of pride and cost and prestige and focused entirely on one thing: getting those three men home. There was still one more crisis waiting for them. As the spacecraft approached Earth on April 17, the crew had to transfer back into the command module, the cold, dark capsule that had been powered down for 3.5 days. They had to power it back up using procedures that had never been tested, working from checklists that had been written from scratch by engineers on the ground during the mission. The lunar module batteries had barely enough power left. The process of powering up the command module in sequence, carefully, precisely, in exactly the right order so as not to overload the fragile remaining power supply, took hours of meticulous work. At any point, a wrong step could have drained the batteries entirely, leaving them with a dead command module and no way to control their re-entry. The heat shield, which would protect them from the 5,000-degree temperatures of atmospheric re-entry, had been immersed in the vacuum of space and subjected to the cold and stress of the journey. No one was completely certain it hadn't been damaged by the initial explosion. If the heat shield failed, they would burn up in the atmosphere. They would have survived the explosion and the carbon dioxide and the cold and the dehydration and the 4-day nightmare of improvised survival, only to die 40 miles above the Earth, in sight of home. The heat shield held. At 1:07 p.m. on April 17, 1970, the Apollo 13 command module Odyssey splashed down in the South Pacific Ocean, 3.5 miles from the USS Iwo Jima, right on target. The parachutes deployed perfectly. The capsule hit the water, and inside it, three men who should have died in space were alive, tired, cold, dehydrated, utterly wrung out, but alive. Jim Lovell, who had traveled further from the Earth than any human being in history on his previous mission, and who had been cheated of his chance to walk on the moon, came back to Earth the way he always did, with controlled professionalism and the quiet dignity of a man who has faced the worst and found it to be survivable. The world erupted. The cheering in Mission Control was unlike anything that room had witnessed, louder perhaps than even the cheering of the Apollo 11 landing. Because this was not celebration of an achievement, this was relief. This was the release of 4 days of held breath, 4 days of dread and prayer and desperate hope. Gene Kranz, who had barely left Mission Control since the explosion, stood at the front of the room and let the noise wash over him, and it is said that he wept, though he would likely deny it because he was Gene Kranz and Gene Kranz did not weep. He had said that failure was not an option. He had been right. In the aftermath, NASA conducted a thorough investigation into the causes of the accident. The damaged wiring in Oxygen Tank 2 was identified as the primary culprit, along with the chain of engineering decisions and testing failures that had allowed the damaged wires to go undetected. Design changes were made. Procedures were revised. A third oxygen tank was added to future Apollo service modules, and the oxygen tanks were redesigned to make them more resistant to fire. Apollo 14 flew safely to the moon in February 1971. The program continued. But Apollo 13 left a mark on the history of space exploration that no successful mission ever quite matched, partly because it was a disaster, because something went catastrophically wrong and people nearly died, but mostly because of what happened next, because of what human beings did when confronted with the impossible, because of the 4-day improvisation of brilliance and determination that brought those three men home. The mission that was supposed to be routine had become historic. The crew that was supposed to walk on the moon had instead done something in some ways more significant. they had demonstrated, in real time, broadcast to the world, exactly what humanity is capable of when it refuses to quit. Jim Lovell was asked once many years after the mission whether he regretted that he never got to walk on the moon. He thought about it carefully, the way he thought about everything, and he said that of course there was some regret. He had trained his whole life for that walk. He had been so close. But he also said that Apollo 13 had taught him something more important than any moonwalk could have. It had taught him, had shown him, had proved to him in the most definitive way possible, that the human spirit, properly directed and properly supported, is equal to any challenge. That there is no problem so large, no situation so desperate, no darkness so complete that the combination of intelligence and determination and teamwork cannot find a way through. Think about that. Think about 3 men in a dying spacecraft, further from home than any human beings had ever been, staring into the black. Think about the men and women in a room in Houston, running on no sleep and pure adrenaline and the refusal to accept the unacceptable, working through the night with pencils and slide rules and sheer bloody-minded determination. Think about the improvised carbon dioxide scrubber held together with a sock and duct tape, somehow impossibly working. Think about the heat shield, battered and cold-soaked and untested, somehow holding together for that last fiery plunge through the atmosphere. Think about the parachutes opening. Think about the splashdown. And then think about this. The people who brought Apollo 13 home did not have advanced artificial intelligence. They did not have the internet. They did not have the computational power that today sits in the phone in your pocket. They had slide rules and pencils and chalkboards and the focused, terrified, brilliant minds of human beings who refused to give up on their fellow human beings. They solved in hours problems that had never been conceived of before, using tools and materials they had on hand, under conditions of stress that would have broken most people, in service of one absolutely non-negotiable goal: those 3 men were going to come home. The Apollo program as a whole is rightly celebrated as one of the greatest achievements in human history. But it was Apollo 13, the mission that failed, the mission that didn't reach its destination, the mission that became a survival story, that showed the world what the people of that program were truly made of. Not the missions that went according to plan. The mission that didn't, because that is when you find out what people are capable of, not when everything is going well. When everything is going wrong. When the oxygen is bleeding into space and the power is dying and you are 200,000 miles from home and there are 3 people alive in a machine that was never designed to keep them alive, and you have to figure out from scratch with what you have how to bring them home. That is when you find out. And in April 1970, the people at NASA found out something magnificent about themselves and about the species they represented. They found out that when it truly matters, when the stakes are as high as stakes can get and the margin for error is zero and the darkness presses in from all sides, human beings are capable of refusing to fail. That the will to survive, properly supported by the will to solve and the will to serve, is among the most powerful forces in the known universe. 3 men went to space and nearly didn't come back. And the story of how they came back anyway became one of the greatest stories ever told about what we are and what we can do when we decide, absolutely, irrevocably, with every resource and every mind and every ounce of will we possess, that failure is not an option. It never was.